The laughter echoed through the grand chamber of the Galactic Council like the final note of a performance no one believed could possibly end in tragedy. It rolled beneath towering crystal arches that stretched higher than mountains, reflecting rivers of blue and silver light across polished floors older than most civilizations. Thousands of representatives from every known corner of the galaxy occupied floating platforms arranged in perfect concentric circles around the central podium. Species of every imaginable form, towering beings of living stone, translucent aquatic diplomats suspended inside shimmering water spheres, feathered scholars with eyes like molten gold, insectoid commanders wrapped in ceremonial armor, and ancient entities whose bodies flickered between dimensions, watched with varying degrees of amusement as the newest member of the council stood alone beneath the enormous celestial dome. Humanity had only recently earned its seat among the stars, and to many of the older races, humans were still viewed as reckless survivors from a violent little world that somehow refused to destroy itself. Ambassador Nathan Hale stood motionless despite the ridicule. His dark uniform bore no unnecessary decorations, only the small silver emblem of Earth resting over his heart. He neither flinched nor answered the whispers spreading across the chamber like wildfire. He had expected disbelief. In truth, he had hoped for it. Because believing his warning meant accepting something far more terrifying, that the greatest civilization ever assembled had spent thousands of years celebrating peace while ignoring the shadows gathering beyond the edge of mapped space. "The signal has returned," Hale said, his calm voice somehow carrying through the enormous chamber without the need for amplification. "Exactly as our projections predicted." A ripple of chuckles swept through the delegates. One senator from the Vekari Dominion leaned toward his neighbor, his glowing mandibles clicking with amusement. "Another human prophecy. Their species does enjoy dramatic storytelling," another replied, drawing more laughter from nearby representatives. Hale remained perfectly still. He had spent the last 6 years reviewing classified records buried beneath Earth's oldest ruins, listening to dying astronomers stationed on forgotten outposts, and watching deep space observatories transmit impossible readings that no known physics could explain. He remembered the exhausted faces of scientists who had whispered the same conclusion after months of sleepless calculations. He remembered military officers quietly mobilizing fleets while politicians insisted there was no threat. Most of all, he remembered the final transmission from Perseus Station, a recording filled with static, frightened breathing, and one sentence repeated over and over before the signal vanished forever. Asterisk, the stars are disappearing. Asterisk. The council still laughed. Then, without warning, every light inside the chamber flickered. The endless holographic map suspended above the delegates trembled as thousands of glowing star systems blinked across its surface. Conversations slowed. A few diplomats looked upward with mild confusion. The display stabilized for a single heartbeat. Then entire regions of the galaxy simply vanished. Not exploded. Not dimmed. Erased. Brilliant clusters that had existed moments earlier were replaced by perfect circles of absolute darkness, as though reality itself had been cut away by an invisible hand. Navigation routes dissolved into nothingness. Trade corridors disappeared. Communication beacons went silent simultaneously. An unnatural hush swallowed the chamber. The laughter ended so abruptly it felt violent. Emergency alarms erupted from every console at once, filling the vast hall with piercing tones that echoed against the crystal walls. Military observers stared in disbelief as automated reports flooded their displays. Long-range colonies had gone offline. Exploration fleets were missing. Entire sectors no longer answered hails. Ambassador Hale slowly lifted his eyes toward the dying star map. His face showed no triumph. Only dread. Because this was exactly how the ancient records had described the beginning. And somewhere beyond the darkness where the galaxy ended, something had finally awakened. The emergency session ended in chaos, but far beyond the political panic consuming the Galactic Council, humanity had already begun moving. Across hundreds of colonies scattered among distant stars, encrypted orders awakened fleets that had spent decades hidden beneath the appearance of ordinary patrol forces. Massive shipyards buried inside asteroid belts roared to life. Orbital defense rings unfolded from dormant positions around frontier worlds. Civilian transports quietly changed course toward fortified shelters. To the rest of the galaxy, these preparations seemed astonishingly fast. To humanity, they were simply the next step in a plan that had been waiting for the wrong day to arrive. On the edge of explored space, where the brilliant highways of interstellar commerce faded into endless darkness, floated the exploration cruiser Resolute. Unlike the elegant ceremonial vessels favored by most Council species, the human ship looked purposeful. Thick armored plating scarred its hull from previous missions. Its engines glowed with restrained power, ready to burn at a moment's notice. Every compartment had been designed with survival in mind rather than prestige. It was not beautiful. It was ready. Standing on the observation deck, Admiral Elena Hayes watched the black horizon through a reinforced viewport stretching nearly 30 meters across. Beyond the transparent alloy, stars shimmered like scattered diamonds across an ocean of infinite night. But something about the view felt wrong. The silence. The darkness. The empty spaces where long-range telescopes insisted faint stars should exist. She folded her hands behind her back, forcing herself to remain calm. Years of command had taught her that fear spread faster than any disease aboard a warship. If the crew saw uncertainty in her eyes, it would infect every deck within minutes. "Status report," she asked quietly. Commander Isaacson stepped beside her, holographic projections hovering above the control console beside him. "Gravitational disturbances continue to increase," he replied. 23% above yesterday's readings. Quantum sensor arrays are detecting repeating wave patterns moving toward inhabited space. Hayes studied the holograms. Perfectly spaced ripples rolled across the galactic map. Not random. Not natural. Deliberate. Like footsteps. The realization settled heavily in her chest. Years earlier, when she had first accepted command of the Resolute, these strange readings had been dismissed as equipment errors. Exotic dark matter currents. Instrument interference. Unknown stellar phenomena. Every explanation sounded reasonable until the patterns began repeating with mathematical precision impossible for any natural process. Human scientists had noticed. Human historians had become interested. And eventually, human archaeologists uncovered something buried beneath Earth's oldest civilizations. Warnings. Not stories. Not religion. Warnings. Ancient stone tablets recovered from forgotten deserts described stars being swallowed by the endless night. Cave paintings older than recorded history showed impossible shapes drifting between constellations while frightened figures watched from burning hillsides. Legends separated by continents, languages, and thousands of years all told the same impossible tale. When the silent sky returns. Humanity had listened. Other civilizations laughed at the idea that primitive ancestors could preserve knowledge across millions of years. Humanity investigated anyway. Now, standing aboard the Resolute, Hayes wondered if those forgotten voices had been speaking directly to this moment. The ship vibrated gently beneath her boots. Not from engines. From the sensors. Every instrument aboard the cruiser had begun resonating with an invisible frequency spreading through space itself. A young communications officer looked up from her station, her face noticeably pale. "Admiral." Hayes turned. "We've received emergency priority signals from 14 frontier colonies." The officer swallowed hard before continuing. "They're all reporting the same thing." She enlarged a live astronomical image onto the bridge's central display. One distant constellation. Simply disappeared. No explosion. No flash. No debris. Only darkness occupying the place where thousands of stars had existed moments before. No one aboard the Resolute spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time, every member of the crew understood that humanity's preparations had never been driven by paranoia. They had been driven by memory. And whatever was approaching the galaxy, it had finally crossed the frontier. The collapse did not begin with explosions or fleets burning across the heavens. It began with silence. One by one, the frontier systems stopped answering. Automated beacons that had transmitted continuously for centuries fell quiet in the middle of ordinary status reports. Merchant convoys entered hyperlanes and never emerged. Planetary observatories stared into familiar constellations only to find empty darkness where entire star systems had existed hours before. No wreckage drifted through space. No emergency broadcasts escaped the void. It was as if the galaxy itself had begun forgetting pieces of its own existence. Panic spread faster than light. Inside the Galactic Council's Emergency Command Center, towering holographic displays refreshed every few seconds, each update worse than the last. Red warning icons multiplied across the galactic map until they resembled an unstoppable infection consuming civilization from the outer rim inward. Admirals argued over fleet deployments. Scientists shouted competing theories. Politicians demanded reassurance that no one could honestly provide. Every prediction failed almost as soon as it was spoken. Deploy the 7th Defense Armada. They're already gone. Send unmanned probes. No signal returns. Open quantum communication with the colonies. They no longer exist on the network. Every answer led only to another impossible question. Across dozens of worlds, billions watched live broadcasts as news anchors struggled to describe an enemy no camera could capture. Refugee ships began arriving from the frontier, their hulls scorched by frantic emergency jumps. The survivors stumbled from their vessels exhausted, terrified, and unable to explain what they had witnessed. There was nothing there, one pilot whispered through trembling lips. Another simply stared into space. The stars, they folded. Medical scans showed no injury severe enough to explain the expressions frozen onto their faces. Yet every survivor carried the same overwhelming terror, as though they had looked directly at something the mind was never meant to understand. Aboard the Resolute, Admiral Elena Hayes stood in the dimly lit Tactical Operations Center while officers processed thousands of incoming distress signals. The bridge, usually calm and methodical, had transformed into a storm of flashing consoles, overlapping voices, and relentless warning alarms. Even the artificial intelligence struggled to organize the flood of disappearing coordinates. Confirmed losses now exceed 47 inhabited systems, Commander Chen reported, his voice unusually strained. Communication blackout expanding at an accelerating rate. Hayes watched the holographic projection. The advancing darkness wasn't random. It curved. Flowed. Moved with intention. Almost like a living tide searching for something. Her thoughts drifted back to Earth's oldest archaeological vaults, where months earlier she had reviewed digital scans of ancient carvings recovered beneath collapsed temples and prehistoric caves. Most Council historians dismissed them as primitive superstition. But one detail had haunted her ever since. Every civilization on ancient Earth, no matter how isolated, no matter how different its language or culture, had recorded nearly identical symbols. Circles without stars. Eyes hidden inside darkness. And a single warning repeated in dozens of forgotten tongues. When the lights vanish, do not follow. At the time, even Hayes had questioned whether coincidence explained the similarities. Now coincidence no longer existed. Deep beneath Earth's polar archives, research teams worked without sleep, comparing those ancient records against the censored data arriving from the frontier. Artificial intelligences translated symbols older than recorded history. Linguists reconstructed extinct languages. Astrophysicists overlaid prehistoric maps onto modern galactic charts. Then an impossible discovery emerged. The patterns matched. Every disappearance. Every gravitational disturbance. Every expanding region of darkness. Someone had documented this exact sequence thousands of years before humanity invented writing. Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature aboard the ship. If those ancient witnesses had truly seen this before, then they hadn't been telling myths. They had been leaving instructions for whoever survived long enough to face the darkness again. Deep beneath the Antarctic ice, farther than any civilian map acknowledged, humanity's oldest secret finally opened its eyes. Massive blast doors, buried under kilometers of frozen rock and protected by technologies spanning centuries, slowly separated with a thunderous groan that echoed through an underground complex known only by a single classified designation, Archive 0. The facility had existed in silence for generations, preserving discoveries considered too disturbing for public knowledge. Now, with entire star systems disappearing from reality itself, every security protocol was abandoned. Scientists, military historians, quantum physicists, linguists, and artificial intelligences worked side by side beneath glaring white lights, racing against a countdown no one could measure. Admiral Elena Hayes arrived through a secure quantum transmission, her holographic image materializing above the central operations chamber. Around her floated thousands of reconstructed fragments recovered from every corner of Earth. Ancient stone tablets. Fossilized metal plates buried beneath prehistoric sediment. Crystal memory lattices discovered beneath the Pacific Ocean. Cave paintings preserved inside sealed caverns untouched for over 100,000 years. For decades these artifacts had appeared unrelated, dismissed as myths, impossible anomalies, or elaborate natural formations. Now they aligned perfectly. A young archaeologist stood frozen before the largest projection, unable to hide the disbelief in her voice. "We've finished translating the final sequence." The chamber fell silent. Symbols carved by forgotten hands slowly transformed into readable language as quantum translation engines completed their calculations. Every sentence emerging from the projection made the room feel colder. They are not conquerors. They are not gods. They are the harvest. An uncomfortable silence settled over the chamber. For millions of years, the galaxy had celebrated its oldest civilizations, believing history followed a steady path of progress from primitive life to advanced empires. That belief collapsed in seconds. The evidence revealed something far darker. Every few million years, just as intelligent civilizations reached unimaginable technological heights, something emerged from the darkness between galaxies. Not to invade. To erase. Entire empires disappeared without leaving meaningful traces. Planets survived, but cultures vanished. Libraries turned to dust. Artificial intelligences fell silent. Hyperlane networks decayed into forgotten ruins. The galaxy did not naturally lose civilizations over time. It was being harvested. The realization spread across the room like ice creeping over glass. "No," one researcher whispered. Another slowly shook his head. "That would mean..." Hayes finished the sentence herself. "We're not the first." The room became impossibly quiet. Historical databases from dozens of council civilizations suddenly made horrifying sense. Every mysterious extinction. Every unexplained archaeological gap. Every legend describing an age when the stars themselves disappeared. They weren't separate mysteries. They were chapters of the same recurring catastrophe. Then another discovery surfaced. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, hidden below tectonic plates older than complex life on Earth, sonar imaging revealed an artificial structure unlike anything humanity had ever built. Its geometry ignored conventional engineering. Its alloys contained atomic arrangements impossible to manufacture using modern technology. Most disturbing of all, the structure emitted the exact quantum frequency now spreading across the galaxy. It had awakened. Archive Zero's artificial intelligence expanded the holographic model until it filled the chamber. The object wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a city. It was a beacon. A defensive network created by survivors of the previous harvest cycle. Someone, perhaps another civilization so ancient their name had been erased by time, had reached Earth after escaping extinction. They had hidden their final creation beneath an insignificant world orbiting an ordinary yellow star, trusting that one day another species would uncover it. Humanity had never inherited the galaxy. It had inherited a warning. And suddenly Ambassador Hale's speech before the Galactic Council took on an entirely different meaning. The countdown he had tried to explain was never humanity's prediction. It was the beacon's activation sequence. Far beyond the edge of mapped space, where light itself seemed afraid to travel, the advancing darkness abruptly changed direction. It had detected the beacon. And now, the harvest was coming for Earth. The moment the beacon locked onto the approaching darkness, humanity stopped asking whether survival was possible and started deciding how much time they could buy for everyone else. Across the solar system, emergency transmissions spread with absolute clarity. There were no speeches promising certain victory. No declarations that everything would be fine. Every message carried the same quiet determination that had defined humanity since the first people looked into an uncertain sky. Hold the line. Within minutes, orbital shipyards around Earth released hundreds of warships that had remained hidden beneath civilian construction platforms for decades. Lunar defense batteries rotated into firing position. Mars activated its underground fusion arrays. Stations orbiting Jupiter and Saturn awakened ancient reactors whose power signatures illuminated the darkness like newborn stars. Humanity's home system transformed into a fortress, not because anyone believed it was invincible, but because it was willing to become the battlefield. Aboard the Resolute, Admiral Elena Hayes stood at the center of the command deck as thousands of tactical icons flooded the holographic display. Human vessels converged from every direction, their engines carving brilliant blue trails across the void. Alongside them came something unexpected. Alien ships. First one. Then dozens. Then hundreds. The same civilizations that had laughed inside the Galactic Council chamber now answered Earth's distress call without hesitation. Pride had died the moment the stars began disappearing. Survival demanded unity. Council fleets entering formation, Commander Chen announced. Hayes looked at the expanding armada. They came. Chen allowed himself a tired smile. They finally listened. Then every sensor aboard the fleet screamed. The darkness arrived. Not as ships. Not as creatures. As absence. A wall of perfect black stretched across the stars, swallowing light itself as it advanced with impossible calm. Space bent around it. Gravity twisted into violent waves that ripped apart abandoned satellites long before the phenomenon reached them. Time flickered unpredictably across nearby instruments. Some clocks accelerated. Others stopped completely. Human pilots watched entire constellations dissolve behind the advancing void as if erased from existence by an unseen hand. Fear settled across every bridge. Hayes felt it herself. Her hands trembled for exactly 1 second. Then she remembered every name carved into Earth's history. People who had crossed oceans without knowing what waited beyond the horizon, firefighters who entered collapsing buildings to save strangers, explorers who accepted impossible odds simply because someone had to go first. Humanity had always been afraid. They had simply refused to let fear make the decision. Activate the beacon, she ordered. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, the ancient structure responded. The planet itself seemed to awaken. Golden energy erupted through Earth's magnetic field, racing across orbit in expanding rings that connected every human vessel into a single synchronized network. Alien scientists stared in disbelief as impossible equations unfolded before their eyes. Human engineers rewrote failing systems in real time, merging modern technology with principles hidden inside the ancient beacon. Weapons designed for conventional warfare transformed into instruments capable of reshaping gravity itself. The harvest met resistance unlike anything it had encountered in countless cycles. Instead of fleeing, humanity advanced. The Resolute accelerated directly toward the darkness. Every Allied fleet followed. Hayes watched the impossible wall grow larger across the bridge viewport until it consumed the stars ahead. There would be no retreat beyond this point. Every officer understood it. Every pilot accepted it. "Transmit to all frequencies," Hayes said quietly. The bridge fell silent. Her voice traveled across millions of ships. "Today, we fight for worlds we've never seen, for lives we'll never know, and for a future that deserves the chance to exist." Then she gave the final command. "All fleets, forward." The combined armada surged into the darkness. For the first time in millions of years, the harvest did not find frightened civilizations waiting to be erased. It found humanity charging straight toward it. When the battle finally ended, there was no triumphant explosion to mark the victory. No roar of celebration echoed across the stars. There was only silence, the kind that follows a storm so immense it changes the meaning of peace forever. The wall of living darkness that had consumed civilizations for millions of years slowly unraveled, dissolving into countless streams of fading light before disappearing into the empty reaches beyond the galactic rim. One by one, stars that had been hidden behind the impossible void shimmered back into existence. Ancient constellations reappeared. Long-range communications crackled to life. Across thousands of worlds, frightened families looked toward the heavens and saw dawn return to the universe itself. The price had been staggering. Drifting through the silent battlefield were the remains of ships from every civilization that had answered Earth's call. Fragments of shattered hulls reflected distant starlight like frozen tears scattered across the cosmos. Escape pods floated quietly among the wreckage, some carrying exhausted survivors, others forever empty. Medical frigates moved methodically between the debris fields, their searchlights cutting through darkness as rescue crews searched for any remaining signs of life. The great exploration cruiser Resolute no longer resembled the proud vessel that had led humanity into battle. Entire sections of its armored hull had been torn away. One engine burned with only a faint blue glow. The once bright emblem of Earth was blackened by fire and scarred by impacts that would be remembered for generations. Admiral Elena Hayes stood alone on the damaged observation deck, looking through fractured transparent alloy toward the stars her crew had protected. The bridge behind her buzzed with reports of survivors, restored communications, and liberated systems, but she barely heard them. Her thoughts remained with the names of those who would never answer another roll call. Friends. Officers. Pilots. Engineers. People who had laughed together only days earlier, never imagining they would become the final shield between existence and oblivion. Victory carried no joy without remembering those who had paid for it. Hours later, representatives from every surviving civilization gathered once more inside the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. It was the same magnificent hall where human warnings had once been greeted with laughter. Now the chamber felt profoundly different. The crystal dome overhead reflected thousands of restored stars, while every delegate stood in complete silence. No speeches interrupted the moment. No political rivalries remained. The empty seats representing civilizations lost during the harvest spoke more loudly than any words ever could. At the center of the chamber, a newly forged monument rose from polished stone, a towering pillar engraved with the names of every human who had fallen so that countless alien worlds could continue to exist. Around its base were inscribed the names of every allied species that had chosen to stand beside them. Ambassador Nathan Hale stepped forward once again. Unlike his previous appearance, he carried no warnings, no predictions, and no accusations. He simply looked across the chamber, meeting the eyes of leaders who had once doubted humanity. Many lowered their gaze, burdened by memories of their own laughter. Hale understood their silence. Fear often disguises itself as disbelief. Humanity had learned that lesson long ago. Without bitterness, he placed one hand against the memorial and quietly said, "None of us survived this alone. Remember that." His words echoed softly beneath the crystal ceiling, carrying more weight than the grandest speech ever delivered within those walls. From that day forward, every civilization entering the Galactic Council received the same lesson before discussing treaties, trade, or politics. They were shown the recordings of the vanished stars, the awakening beacon beneath Earth's oceans, and the impossible battle fought at the edge of existence. They learned that humanity's greatest strength had never been superior technology or unmatched weapons. It was the stubborn refusal to surrender when hope seemed irrational. And whenever a young delegate asked why the Council treated human warnings with such immediate respect, the oldest ambassadors would simply glance toward the memorial, where countless names shimmered beneath the restored stars, and answer with words that became immortal across the galaxy. If the humans say something impossible is coming, don't laugh. Listen.